So I'm Pippa White. I'm one of the trustees of Hazelnut and a vicar in Bristol as well. And as I say, Cate Williams is going to be sharing with us in this workshop about hope, anxiety and climate activism. And Cate is the Environment Engagement Officer for Gloucester Diocese, with a particular brief leading the diocesan plans towards the goal of carbon neutrality by 2030. Cate also has a PhD in pioneer ministry and is really involved in Forest Church. So I'm going to hand over to Cate now.
Okay, I've got an almost completed PhD. I think I was slightly over enthusiastic when I said I'd finished, but I'm at that point where I've done my viva and I'm writing my corrections, so nearly there. The reason that's important, I don't always kind of shout about academics, but actually what I'm speaking about this afternoon is rooted in some fieldwork that I did as part of my PhD in Stroud, which is not very far from where I live, not that far from Hazelnut either. And I wanted to share with you the vision that they have for supporting the spirituality of activists of all faiths and no faith in their community. So it's something that goes beyond the spirituality within the church and is an offer from the Christian community to anybody who would like to engage with it. So they have put things together in such a way that it's open and accessible and can support all people who are struggling to stay hopeful whilst working for activists of various different kinds. And I think any of us who have tried to be activists in any kind of way know how hard it is to stay hopeful sometimes, where you work for things and it feels like it's, you know, step forwards, a couple of steps backwards, and keeping positive and keeping hopeful can be quite problematic. But and salt and yeast are the images that come to mind, and that sense that as Christians we shouldn't be staying within our own little circles, but getting out there and mixing in and bringing life in wider forums than just what we can do. Both in the worshipping life of the church, but also in the kind of the active and the outward life of the church. That there are things that we can do which go beyond that even, and break down all the boundaries and work with all people of goodwill for the sake of a common vision. I suspect that we often think too small when we think about the vision of God and our calling as Christians. There are many in our wider communities who are open to spiritual wisdom and resourcing. And wouldn't it be good if we could offer that in a much more open and a much more open way than we, and more confident way than we tend to do. So I'm going to start off talking about my fieldwork in Stroud and then go on to some more general comment. This is an article from The Observer that is the backdrop to my fieldwork, which was in 2018. We have heard a critique of Extinction Rebellion earlier this afternoon, but I'm going to start with the assumption that although there are problems in certain ways, there is lots that is good as well, and that they have been part of raising the profile of environmental concerns over the last couple of years in the way that it really seems to have gathered energy lately. So Stroud, the gentle Cotswold town that spawned a radical protest in The Observer. Stroud is one of the homes of Extinction Rebellion. It's a very unusual, bohemian, greeny kind of a place where there are all kinds of activists of all faiths, of and all worldviews that are working together for all kinds of things, and one of the homes of Extinction Rebellion. So I interviewed Simon Howells, who's a pioneer minister in Stroud in October 2018. shortly before before Extinction Rebellion first hit the headlines. And this is what he said: a lot of the guys are going on a march in November to the climate march. They're probably half of them. They won't be afraid to be arrested. They'll be fearless in all of that stuff. So what Simon is doing in Stroud is trying to work out how he can support those anybody and everybody who is working for kingdom values, whether or not they name it as such. And this is what he says: we do well in being a place where people of green spirituality feel it's promoted and can be expressed. Activists need a meditative side, and I think we can be very helpful there. Activists need a meditative side. So what tends to be in the profile for activists is the action. It's there in the word, in the doing, but there always needs to be that ebb and flow between action, between refreshing and renewing and reflecting. And so Simon finds himself wondering how the church can offer something to the meditative side that is needed for activists. So the background to all of this is burnout, and burnout, Louise Fitzgerald being quoted here. Burnout is a huge problem amongst green activists. How do we keep going? How do we keep taking the next step forward when the problem is so huge, when it seems such an insurmountable problem, and such a small thing that each one of us can do? How do we prevent burnout and keep ourselves moving forward and going forward? And this is a screenshot from a huge report from the American Psychology Association. And this is a 70-page document about mental health and climate change that they've put together about how real the impact of climate change is on mental health and anxiety. And we're just living with this as our backdrop constantly. We know that there's a problem. We don't know how we're going to fix it, and that is not good for us. And unlocking that anxiety is actually key to action, because the temptation when feeling that kind of anxiety is actually to push it to one side, not to be an activist, and just to kind of get on with life as normal, and to cease moving forwards, because that's just too difficult and too hard to keep up. So we need hope. We need something which is going to keep us going. We need something which is going to allow us to move beyond that that anxiety, and to find our place, to find our way, to find the next steps that we could take. And I should say that when I use the word activists in Stroud's story, Extinction Rebellion is part of that story. I'm not meaning just the waving banners kind of activism. I'm using a broader definition. So any of us who are working for change in small community things that might be invisible, as well as in the kind of the big waving the flag kind of a thing. But all of us need something which keeps us moving forward and that stops us from giving up. And I see two sides to the Christian contribution. One is the spirituality itself, and that's prominent in Stroud. They use arts and music primarily as a forum to enable spirituality that can be open, that people can find their entry and their way of participating, whether or not they would call themselves Christian themselves, and they might have other faith commitments as well. So the arts and music for them are the medium that they use to enable spirituality for the whole community, or all that wish to be a part of that. And the other side of the Christian hope is more theological. So we've got spirituality and theology in partnership here, and that is that we are part of a bigger story, and that God is at work. The mess that humanity has made is not the only story that can be told about what is going on here. There is also what God is doing, and the fact that God is not going to let go of what God has made. The end of the story isn't just that we've messed up, and the kind of apocalyptic in the negative sense of that is the only way we can go, but we know that God redeems and renews, that we know that God brings good out of the worst that can happen. We know that actually we are part of a story where it seemed that all was lost, and Jesus died on the cross, and there was resurrection, there was new hope, and there is always hope. So what does hope look like? What does it mean that hope passes through the cross for us in these times of climate crisis? And it's one thing it certainly means is that when it seems that all is lost, all is not lost, and there is more to come. So back to Stroud. So many images I could have thrown up there. I've given you an indoors one, but they actually have a sacred music festival every year, except for the last few years for obvious reasons, because it's too many people gathered in too small a space. But they, for the last few years, have held a sacred music festival, which is in the church and in other buildings in the town centre and in outdoor spaces. Very carefully worked out so that the church hosts certain things where Christian, where it is Christian within the church space, and there's also things happening in the town hall, and there's also things happening outside in a community space that is nearby. Very carefully, very subtly worked out with integrity, so the idea is that everybody needs to stop and to pause and to be refreshed and renewed in community, and in spirit, and that the church has an offer for all to connect with something that is bigger than ourselves, we just need that baseline. We need to know that we're part of a story that is bigger than just ourselves, and that offers help, and that keeps us going. It does get theologically complicated, bearing in mind that if we're wanting to offer hope to the whole conversation, and not just to signed up church Christians, we can't assume that everybody in our wider communities agrees with us. We're living in post-Christendom realities where there's religious pluralism around us and a whole set of various different worldviews. So how can we speak into the situation when not all are calling ourselves Christians and not all are accept the story that we live by? And I want to suggest that there are two choices in front of us. The standard, the mainstream Christian approach is to encourage people to become Christians, and then speak with them about the Christian wisdom on the questions around us in wider society. But I think what the pioneering is doing in Stroud, and what I wanted to suggest that we explore, is working from the outside in. So encourage the people around us with Christian wisdom, offer into the conversation things that are rooted in our own tradition, and just allow that to be part of the conversation in a way that encourages and enables and supports. Some will want to explore more deeply with the churches, and certainly that's something that they have found in Stroud, that when they work from this outside in approach, some become intrigued and want to explore some more. Others may not, but they have still been resourced for the work that they are doing which is kingdom work, which holds in front of it that bigger vision of the kingdom of God, which is the purpose of the church, which is what we are called to as Christians, to be working for the values and the coming of God's kingdom in all kinds of ways. So I'm drawing here in many ways on Newbigin's classic book, The Gospel in a Pluralist Society, and he's drawing on his experience in India, which was a pluralist society before we knew it and were living it here in Britain. And some of the headlines that I take from Newbigin are the focus on the bigger story, kingdom first, as I've been saying, that being saved is to do with the part we're playing in God's story. And that's the story of this world and this life and creation and people and planet kind of here and now, taking the focus off of what happens, in the other side of death in eternity, which is still kind of part of our Christian understanding, but just take the focus off of that and wondering how salvation plays itself out in this life and in this world. So that kingdom first approach allows us to find partners of goodwill in other faiths and other worldviews in our wider community that share some of our vision for community and planet and the interconnection of all things. Another headline that I take from Newbigin is the significance of the Christian perspective, because I think we can sometimes be so careful not to be arrogant that we actually forget to say the things that we do have within our tradition, which are gifts to the conversation. So Newbigin reminds us that there are things that are important in our faith and in the story of God in Christ. And don't forget to tell that. Don't forget to speak that in the conversation, and just to share of ourselves and to share of our perspective with others around us. But to do so without arrogance, to do so in a way that is learning and listening as well as sharing. So genuine conversation and genuine partnership. So by way of not being arrogant, a few things which are helpful for the conversation that don't come specifically from the Christian tradition. And looking at the time, I'm going to skip through these very quickly. But Rebecca Solnit, I love this book, reminding us of the stories that tell us how far we've come, the untold stories, and how much, the things that we've campaigned for and therefore haven't happened. And so there's very little to see for it because it hasn't happened, but that's good. Naomi Klein talking about how people need their imaginations to be challenged, to see that there are different ways, and therefore to live in what we campaign for. And Joanna Macy and Chris Johnstone talking about how hope needs to be active, something that we do, something that we live, and not a passive hope. But then coming back into the Christian tradition, Jim Wallace reminding ourselves of how people are longing for an inclusive vision of the common good, how many around us actually share a vision and will work with us if we are open to working with them. So hope. I've said this already, so I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly. But God will not let go. God will not let go. God is at work. So all that we do is taking steps with God, who is at work, God's self. Tom Wright, many know Tom Wright, and all that I have said about hope that is grounded in this world and what God is doing here and now is key biblical stuff. This isn't going off track, but we don't seem to talk about it very much in churches. So a reminder to come back to this worldly perspective on what God is doing with all that God has created. and Walter Brueggemann, and there's some real resources for the conversation in here about hopeful imagination, the imagination that comes out of the post-exilic prophets. When all seemed lost, no doubt there were exhausted, despairing people around these three poets who saw nothing new, who hoped nothing new, who could speak nothing new. And in that hopeless situation came the voices of the prophets bringing wisdom. And that is wisdom that we bring with us in our tradition, that we can speak into the world around us that also has lost hope. So Jeremiah, Brueggemann says, talks about letting go in order to move on and discover the new. The place of lament, which we've heard about a lot in this conference, the place of lament as key to the process of letting go. And when we let go, God catches us, and then we can move into something new and something hopeful. Ezekiel talks about the importance of righteous living and how impossible it is without drawing close to the source. So we're actually set free from an anxiety to be perfect because we're just not going to be. So then we draw close to the source and are given the new hope, the new heart in order to live in the future that God has for us. And then Isaiah, memory and story as a resource to take us into the future. So people were accepting the bad situations because they could see no alternative. So storytelling about new and alternative possibilities, again, which we've been doing as part of this conference. We've been storytelling about new possibilities, and then the storytelling that roots us in what has gone with the past and that takes us into the future. So I'm going to end here, but some aspects of God's story, which I think enable us to hope, enable us not to live in anxiety, but to take the steps forward that we need to take. Humanity doesn't need to die out for ecology to stabilize, rather we need to step into our calling. God will not let go of creation. God's at work too. It's not just dependent on us. That paradox of dying to live, which is so core to Christian understanding, community, reconciliation, starting from the margins, the prophetic tradition. There's so much in our tradition that we can speak from, speaking wisdom into the situations around us. And let's do that widely. Let's not just keep that to ourselves within the church, but let's have conversations with others around us so that we can work in. We need everybody on board to change the world at this point. So let's speak our wisdom into the conversation. Let's hear from others, from their wisdom, and see what we can do together. So I'm going to end there, and there's probably not much time for questions, but there might be time for one or two.
I think we've got 2 minutes, but thank you, Kate, for that really clear and inclusive articulation of hope. It's really good to hear that in the midst of the difficult things that we're engaging with. I've got a question from Charles. We've probably got 2 minutes for this, about the encyclical from Pope Francis, Laudato Si, encourage people to seek help from the Holy Spirit as part of this. So in what way do you steer people in these conversations, perhaps in Stroud, towards the Holy Spirit? Would you name it or not?
I think that the way they go about it in Stroud is through arts and music, and there's prayerfulness behind that. So, and absolutely, it's an invitation to the Spirit, and absolutely agree with that. That we need that refreshment and renewing in the Spirit. Sometimes named and sometimes not. I would say. I think that there's just a discernment about time and place to know when's the time to speak that, or when the time's just to allow God to be at work, and God to do what God does, and that's enough.
Well, thank you, Kate. I think we're going to end there, but a reminder to people that this content will be available on the Hazelnut YouTube, so you can go back and pick up some of those points as well, some really good points to hold on to, I think. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. So in 5 minutes, this room will be hosting a documentary premiere for anyone who wants to stay on for that. A Wilderness Like Eden, Stories of Food and Faith with its creator, Derek Weston. So I think that promises to be excellent. I'm going to hand over to John now, who is going to host that session.